I did not awaken screaming, though perhaps that would have been more honest. Because the first sensation that reached me was not fear, but weight the crushing, cathedral-like pressure of a sky that did not belong to nature, pressing down upon my chest as if the heavens themselves had been reforged into iron and lowered to suffocate mankind. And when my eyes opened, they did not find stars, but vaulted darkness rid with steel arches, each one engraved with scripture so old and aggressive it felt less like prayer and more like a threat. And the air tasted of ash, oil, and sanctified decay, a stench I recognized instinctively as the perfume of eternal punishment. For a long moment, I believed myself still dreaming, caught in some lingering echo of my own verses. Because I had walked hell once before, catalogued its horrors with careful symmetry, and survived by believing that suffering, when ordered, could be understood, but this place rejected order in the way a wound rejects healing. And as distant bells tolled, with the resonance of planetary engines, I realized with a tightening in my throat that this was not a dream conjured by guilt or imagination, but a future vast and fully realized, where damnation had not only endured but evolved. I rose from the stone floor with effort, my limbs trembling, and felt the texture beneath my palms warm despite the cold air, as if the ground itself retained the memory of countless bodies dragged across it. And when I looked closer, I saw that the stone was not stone at all, but fused bone, and metal skulls crushed into a single architectural mass, their empty eye sockets staring outward in mute testimony. And I felt then the first true ripple of terror, not because of the dead, but because of the reverence with which they had been arranged, every fragment placed with care, as though suffering itself had been consecrated. Voices began to intrude upon my awareness, not one or two, but thousands layered atop one another, chanting in tones stripped of warmth, repeating litanies that spoke of duty, obedience, sacrifice, and of being called the Emperor. And though I had never heard his name before, my soul recoiled from it as if recognizing an older, colder synonym for God, one that demanded faith. Without mercy, I followed the sound instinctively, my footsteps echoing through corridors so immense that entire armies could have marched abreast within them. And along the walls, I passed murals depicting wars that spanned stars. Human figures reduced to tiny shape, crushed beneath titanic armored angels wielding flaming swords, and guns that spat light, like divine judgment. And I understood with sickening clarity that this civilization had taken my hell and scaled it to a galactic proportion, replacing demons with men who no longer remembered how to be anything else. The screams reached me before the chamber did, thin and broken, worn smooth by a repetition. And when I crossed the threshold, I witnessed a ritual that made the punishments of my ninth circle seem merciful by comparison. A man bound to a throne of iron, his skull split and wired into a machine that drank his thoughts as fuel, while a robed figure of steel and cables whispered mechanical prayers, praising the loss of flesh, praising the death of weakness, praising a future where humanity would survive by ceasing to be human at all. And when the man's eyes augmented, glowing, no longer entirely his locked onto mine, he did not beg for rescue or mercy, but for validation, gasping out the word saint as though I were part of the process that justified his agony. And in that moment, I felt something fracture inside me, because hell, I had learned, is most effective when its victims believe they deserve it. Alarms thundered suddenly, deep and resonant, shaking dust from the ceiling like falling ash, and from the shadows emerged warriors. So immense they seemed sculpted rather than born encased in crimson armor etched with wings, and blood drops their presence bending the air with sheer mass and authority. And when one of them turned his helmet toward me, lenses glowing with a predator's focus, I felt the instinctive terror of prey before an apex god. Yet there was something else there too: recognition, purpose, and an unsettling reverence. And when he spoke my name, Dante, not as inquiry, but as confirmation. I understood that I had not merely fallen forward in time, but into a role already prepared for me, a myth waiting to be repurposed. And as they surrounded me, escorting rather than restraining, I looked once more at the man on the throne, his screams now fading into static as his mind was stripped bare, and I wondered with a scholar's despair and a sinner's clarity whether the true horror of this age was not that hell existed, but that it had convinced its inhabitants that it was salvation, and that somewhere at the center of this vast, grinding nightmare, a silent emperor sat upon his own throne of suffering, sustaining an entire galaxy through eternal torment, proving at last that even God, given enough time and power, could become indistinguishable from the devil. The corridor they led me through felt less like a passage and more like a procession route, designed to crush humility into the soul, its length measured not in steps, but in centuries. Every meter layered with banners commemorating wars that had erased entire civilizations. And as the Crimson Giants escorted me onward, their footsteps sensing with a distant pulse of machinery like a planetary heartbeat, I began to understand that this Imperium did not merely conquer space, it ritualized ignorance, transforming survival itself into a sacred obligation. The air grew warmer, their father. We went thick with incense and ozone, and my ears rang with overlapping choirs, human voices, machine cant, Vox-amplified sermons, all orbiting a single gravitational center of meaning. And though no one had yet spoken his name again, I felt him before I saw him, a presence like a black sun exerting pressure on thought, bending belief into submission. And when the doors finally opened, they did not part with elegance, but with effort, grinding against one another as if reluctant to reveal what lay beyond. And I was struck by the scale of the chamber, a space so vast it mocked the notion of interior, filled with scaffolds, cables, and arcane engines ascending into darkness. And at its heart, framed by a forest of golden machinery, sat the throne. I had imagined thrones before, adorned seats symbolizing authority, but this was no seat. It was a prison disguised as an altar, a colossal life support engine crusted with relics and skulls, its surfaces inscribed with prayers, etched over older prayers until language itself had become a scar. And upon it, suspended between existence and oblivion, was the Emperor of mankind. Or what remained of him, a desiccated figure bound by cables thicker than tree trunks. I understood that this hell consumed not bodies, but futures, that it required belief as fuel, and that it had engineered faith so total that its victims thanked it for their annihilation. A voice entered my thoughts, then not spoken aloud, but impressed upon my consciousness with crushing force, and though it did not use words as men do, I understood it nonetheless. A vast fragmented awareness acknowledging me not as an individual, but as a pattern, a symbol, drawn from an earlier age. And in that instant, I grasped the terrible truth that the Emperor did not speak, because speech implied choice, and he had none left. His was stretched thin across the galaxy, holding back unspeakable horrors from the immaterial realm beyond, a realm where demons clawed ceaselessly at the walls of reality, drawn by human emotion like sharks to blood. And suddenly the Imperium's cruelty acquired a context that did not excuse it, but explained it. For this was a species besieged not only by alien flesh and steel, but by the very consequences of its own thoughts. I remembered then my own journey through the circles, how each sin shaped its punishment, and I saw that humanity here was trapped in a similar logic. Their fear birthing monsters, their hatred empowering gods of war and excess, their despair feeding a warp that reflected them in monstrous form, and the Emperor, for all his tyranny, was the final bulwark against extinction, a suffering linchpin holding a universe together by agony alone. And this realization did not comfort me, it horrified me more deeply than ignorance ever could, because it meant there was no villain left to condemn without condemning survival itself, One of the Crimson Warriors knelt beside me, then removing his helm to reveal a scarred ancient face marked by centuries of war, and he spoke softly, reverently, telling me that this was the price of existence that mankind endured, because it accepted damnation willingly, and as I looked again upon the Emperor eternally dying, yet never allowed to die, one felt a wave of despair, and like any I had known, a despair rooted not in suffering, but in necessity. And I understood that this hell had no exit because it was built to prevent something worse, a deeper abyss waiting just beyond the veil. And as the machinery thundered and the choirs rose to a deafening crescendo, I realized that my role here was not to judge or escape, but to bear witness once more, to record a truth too vast and terrible for faith alone to carry, that in the far future, there is no redemption, only endurance. And even God must scream forever, so that mankind may live another day. The truth of the warp was not revealed to me through lecture or scripture, but through exposure, as all damnations ultimately are. When the chamber has light dimmed, and the Emperor's silent pressure receded just enough for something else to push through, a psychic undertow that seized my thoughts and dragged them outward, tearing away the comforting solidity of metal and stone until I found myself standing nowhere at all, suspended in a vastness that felt wet with emotion, where colors bled into one another like bruises, and the concept of direction dissolved into intention. And I understood at once that this was not merely another realm, but a mirror polished by suffering, a reflection of every fear, hatred, desire, and regret humanity had ever produced and then forgotten. And as shapes began to form within that seething immaterial ocean vast, antlered silhouettes, crowns of flame, towers of shifting flesh, I recognized with a scholar's dread that I was not seeing monsters born independently of mankind, but gods gestated within it, parasites fattened on belief and excess, each one a living embodiment of a vice I had once catalogued as sin, now ascended to cosmic sovereignty. The first presence to loom near me radiated endless hunger, its form constantly splitting and rejoining, a cacophony of laughter and screams braided together. And I felt desire clawed my thoughts, not crude lust alone, but the insatiable craving for sensation, novelty, and transcendence. And I knew this must be Slaanesh, the god birthed when an entire civilization drowned itself in pleasure, a deity who proved that damnation could be beautiful if framed correctly. Another presence followed, vast and simmering, its outline forged of rusted blades and roaring fire, emanating a pressure that reduced thought to instinct, and I felt anger rise unbidden. Hot and righteous, the intoxicating simplicity of violence as solution. And I understood Khorne not as a demon of mindless bloodshed, but as the final, distilled form of every war ever justified as necessary. The warp trembled then, and a third god emerged like a swelling wound, bloated and dripping with decay yet exuding a sickening warmth, a promise of acceptance through surrender. And despair wrapped around me like a blanket, whispering that resistance was futile, that entropy was mercy, and I recognized Nurgle as the patron of those who had simply given up, whose suffering had become so total that rot felt like relief. The fourth presence did not fully coalesce, instead remaining a shifting storm of symbols and possibilities, eyes opening and closing within patterns of impossible geometry, and my thoughts fragmented under his gaze, probabilities collapsing and reforming. And I understood Tzeentch as the god of schemes and hope twisted into manipulation, proof that even ambition, when detached from compassion, could damn an entire species. I wanted to flee, to wake, to retreat back into the familiar horror of steel and skulls. But the warp does not permit withdrawal, only transformation, and as these gods circled me, I felt them probing, tasting my memories, my writings, my fear, and I realized with a chill deeper than any frozen circle that they knew me, not as Dante the man, but as Dante the concept, the one who once gave structure to hell, who taught suffering how to narrate itself, and I felt their amusement at the irony of my presence here. A mortal chronicler confronted with an infinite, self-writing damnation. Then, like a distant lighthouse in a storm of madness, I sensed the Emperor again. He was straining against the warp's tide, holding it at bay through sheer psychic agony. And I finally comprehended the scale of his sacrifice, for every moment of his unending torment was a moment. These gods were denied full entry into reality. Every scream he could not voice a barrier against annihilation, and yet even his defense was imperfect, riddled with cracks through which demons slipped, manifesting in real space as clawed horrors that tore through cities and minds alike. Feeding this cycle anew, the warp showed me visions then, not prophecy, but consequence worlds consumed by chaos when faith faltered. Civilizations erased not by invasion, but by internal collapse. And I saw that the Imperium's cruelty was not merely paranoia, but a brutal calculus. A belief that oppression was preferable to extinction, that ignorance was safer than curiosity, and that hope, when uncontrolled, could birth gods. This revelation crushed me, because it left no moral high ground to stand upon, only gradients of atrocity measured against survival. And as the warp receded and I felt myself dragged back into my body, into the suffocating cathedral of the Golden Throne, I understood that this hell was not imposed from without, but generated continuously from within, a self-sustaining engine of fear and faith, and that humanity's greatest enemy was not the alien or the demon, but its own unexamined soul. When I opened my eyes, the Emperor remained silent, the machinery still roaring, the priests still chanting, and yet everything had changed. Because now I knew that my earlier journey through hell had been a simplification, a child's map of a far greater labyrinth, and that here, in the 41st millennium, damnation was no longer a destination, but a process, an eternal negotiation between annihilation and atrocity. And as I rose slowly to my feet, my mind heavy with truths no verse could ever fully contain, I wondered whether my presence here served any purpose at all, or whether I too had been absorbed into the warp's narrative, another thought, another witness, feeding the very gods I now understood too well, trapped forever in a universe where even awareness is a form of sin. When they released me from the psychic pressure of the throne chamber, I expected relief, but what followed was worse. Because clarity is a sharper instrument than terror, and as I was led away through halls, where history itself seemed bolted into the walls, I began to notice the smaller details I had missed before. The children kneeling in alcoves reciting prayers they were too young to understand. The workers missing limbs yet smiling with devotional pride. The endless processions of the dead carried not with grief, but with efficiency, and I understood that. This Imperium did not merely rule through fear, but through normalization, teaching its people from birth that suffering was not a tragedy, but a contribution. They brought me to a world city next, a planet entirely consumed by habitation, its surface buried beneath layers of habitation, stacked upon habitation, until the sky was a myth preserved only in sanctioned texts. And as I stood upon a balcony overlooking a chasm of humanity, so vast it induced vertigo, I saw millions moving in coordinated exhaustion, their lives measured in shifts and quotas. Their prayers broadcast through rusted loudspeakers that promised salvation in exchange for obedience. And I felt the weight of it press against my chest, because this was not hell as spectacle, but hell as routine, stripped of drama and rendered mundane, which I now realized was its most perfected form. I walked among them unseen, or perhaps unremarked, my robes marking me as just another sanctioned oddity in a civilization built on sanctioned oddities. And I listened as a mother taught her child the correct posture for prayer, warning him that incorrect devotion could invite corruption. And when the child asked what corruption was, she answered not with fear, but with certainty, explaining that it was anything the Imperium had not approved, and I felt a cold understanding settle in me that this society had weaponized morality itself, turning good and evil into administrative categories rather than ethical ones. Later, I witnessed a public execution in a plaza the size of a city district, where a man accused of heresy was bound to a metal frame and interrogated not for truth, but for example his crime never fully explained, because explanation invites thought, and thought invites deviation. And as the crowd watched in reverent silence, I saw not cruelty in their faces, but relief, because the punishment of one reaffirmed the safety of the many. And I remembered the souls frozen in ice at the center of my ninth circle, eternally gnawing and gnawed. And I realized with a bitter clarity that betrayal here was not of individuals, but of uniformity itself. The Space Marines who escorted me angels of death worshipped as demigods moved through this suffering without comment, and when I finally asked one of them whether this endless oppression ever troubled him, he paused for a fraction of a second, a pause so brief it might have been imagined. Before answering that discomfort was irrelevant, that purpose outweighed sentiment, and that humanity survived precisely because it no longer indulged in questions that we can resolve. And in that moment, I understood that these warriors were not monsters, but conclusions. The inevitable endpoint of a philosophy that valued endurance above all else. As night fell o'er what passed for night, beneath artificial skies I was shown the manufactorums, places where entire generations lived and died feeding machines whose products they would never see, and the noise there was constant, a metallic roar, punctuated by prayer, each laborer chanting litanies to appease the spirits of the machines they operated. And though I knew these spirits were mislayered over technology barely understood, the devotion was real, and I felt an unexpected sorrow, because faith, even misdirected, was often the last refuge of the powerless. And here, it had been co-opted into a maintenance protocol. I was taken then to the edge of the city, where the lowest levels sank into darkness and waste, and there I saw the underhighs. Places so lawless and desperate they might have been annexes of the warp itself, and I watched gangs fight over scraps while preaching twisted versions of imperial doctrine, their violence framed as devotion. And I realized that chaos did not always arrive as invasion, but often as interpretation. A truth distorted just enough to become monstrous. Through it all, I felt the warp watching, reacting, feeding, its tide swelling with every fear and every act of repression, and I finally understood. The terrible feedback loop at the heart of this age, the Imperium oppressed humanity to protect it from chaos, and in doing so, generated the very emotions that strengthened chaos in the first place. A cycle so vast and entrenched that no single act of mercy could interrupt it. As I stood at the edge of that city world, gazing out over an ocean of lights flickering like dying stars, I felt a profound weariness settle into my soul, not the exhaustion of travel, but the fatigue of comprehension. And I wondered whether my own journey through hell had contributed to this fate, whether by teaching mankind to categorize sin, I had made damnation easier to institutionalize. And the thought haunted me, because if hell could be optimized, then perhaps it had always been inevitable. When at last I was left alone given a chamber that felt luxurious only by contrast, I lay awake, listening to the distant hum of the city and the ever-present murmur of prayer, and I realized that this age did not need devils with horns and claws, because it had replaced them with systems, traditions, and unquestioned necessities. And as sleep finally claimed me heavy and dreamless, I knew with a scholar's despair that this was the most complete hell I had ever witnessed, not because it was cruel, but because it believed itself righteous.
It was after that night, when sleep finally loosened its grip on me like a reluctant jailer, that I began to sense the fracture beneath the Imperium's monumental certainty, because no structure built entirely on endurance can remain seamless forever. And as I moved deeper into this age, not escorted now, but permitted, which was far more unsettling, I encountered whispers that did not appear in proclamations or sermons, but in pauses, in glances held a fraction too long, in prayers that faltered at the edges. And I realized that even here, in a civilization that had perfected repression into doctrine, doubt still found ways to breathe. I met scholars whose libraries were sealed behind layers of authorization, men and women who studied fragments of forbidden histories, not out of rebellion but necessity, because understanding the past was the only way to prevent its worst repetitions. And yet every one of them lived under the knowledge that curiosity itself was a capital crime, that to ask why was to risk annihilation. And as they spoke to me in hushed tones about lost technologies, forgotten ideals, and the Emperor's original vision, a humanity united, not by fear but by reason, I felt a slow, aching sorrow take root. Because this hell was not born fully formed. It had grown from compromise layered upon compromise, until the original intent was buried beneath necessity. They showed me relics from the Great Crusade, images of worlds brought into compliance not solely through fire but through promise. And I saw then that the Imperium had once believed in progress, had once imagined a future where knowledge was salvation rather than threat, and that belief had died not in a single betrayal, but in a long war against the warp that punished optimism more brutally than despair ever could. I witnessed an inquisitorial tribunal next, not as a defendant but as an observer. And I watched as entire bloodlines were condemned based on probability rather than proof, their execution justified as statistical mercy. And while the logic was chillingly sound, better 1,000 innocents burned than one heretic spared, I felt something recoil within me, because this was the final triumph of hell, when moral atrocity no longer required malice, only arithmetic. Yet even there, amid the black armor and sigils of absolute authority, I sensed fear, not of chaos, but of failure. Because every inquisitor knew that if they were wrong even once, the consequences would not be personal but planetary, and that knowledge hollowed them out, turning vigilance into obsession and justice into reflex. The warp responded to this climate as it always does, swelling and mutating, and I saw reports of cult uprisings, sparked not by excess or ambition, but by despair so profound it curdled into worship, entire hablocks turning to dark gods, not because they desired damnation, but because damnation at least acknowledged their suffering. And I understood then that chaos was not merely an external enemy but an alternative narrative, one that promised meaning where the Imperium offered only duty. In a moment of grim irony, I realized that my own works, stripped of context and compassion, could easily serve such a purpose, providing structure to anguish without offering escape. And the thought struck me like a blow, because it meant that even my attempt to map hell might have helped future generations accept it as inevitable. As I continued my passage through this age, I encountered a dying guardsman on a battlefield littered with wreckage and prayer banners, his body shattered by shrapnel, his breath shallow and wet, and when he saw me he did not ask to be saved but to be remembered, telling me with fading pride that he had held the line long enough that his sacrifice mattered. And as I knelt beside him and felt his life ebb away, I understood that this Imperium survived not on the will of its rulers or the strength of its angels, but on the quiet acceptance of billions who believed their deaths were bricks in a wall holding back oblivion. That realization did not absolve the system, but it complicated my hatred of it, because to condemn the Imperium entirely was to dismiss the genuine courage embedded within its machinery, courage that chaos could never replicate, only corrupt. The warp recoiled from such moments, I noticed, shrinking slightly when sacrifice was chosen consciously rather than enforced, and this subtle reaction revealed a truth both hopeful and tragic, that even in this perfected hell, there existed small acts of resistance, not through rebellion, but through intention, through the refusal to let suffering be meaningless. Yet these moments were fragile, easily drowned beneath the Imperium's grinding need for order. And as I watched another world declared, exterminatus, its surface scoured clean by fire to prevent corruption from spread, and I felt the full weight of inevitability settle upon me, because no amount of individual virtue could halt a system designed to escalate, to respond to threat with annihilation, to trade futures for present survival again and again until nothing remained to save. Standing aboard the vessel that carried out the order, I looked down at a planet dying in silence, its cities reduced to ash before its people could even understand their sentence, and I realized that this act, more than any demon or god, represented the ultimate expression of hell in this age. the willingness to erase entire worlds not out of hatred but out of grim resolve. And as the fire consumed atmosphere and ocean alike, I felt a numb acceptance creep into my thoughts, a dangerous understanding of why such decisions were made, and I recoiled from it, because to fully comprehend this logic was to risk embracing it. By the time I returned to solitude, my soul felt stretched thin, pulled between empathy and horror, and I finally understood the Emperor's true tragedy, not that he suffered eternally, but that his suffering had taught humanity to equate pain with purpose, endurance with virtue, and extinction with mercy. And as I reflected on all I had seen, I recognized that this hell was not static, but adaptive, capable of justifying anything so long as it delayed the end. And that perhaps the most terrifying truth of all was this, that given the same knowledge, the same threats, and the same fear of oblivion, I could no longer be certain I would have chosen differently. By the time I understood that my presence in this age was no longer accidental but tolerated with intent, it was already too late to pretend I was merely an observer, because the Imperium does not permit neutrality any more than hell allows escape. And as I was summoned once more, this time not by armored giants but by robed envoys bearing seals older than entire star systems, I felt the subtle shift from witness to instrument, a transition so quiet it felt almost merciful. And they brought me to a place rarely spoken of, a chamber suspended between material space and the immaterial, where the veil was thin enough to bruise, and where sanctioned psychers sat in circles, their eyes burned out, their minds open like wounds, channeling fragments of the Emperor's will into something approximating communication. It was there, amid the scent of ozone and scorched flesh, that I was shown what the Imperium feared most, not chaos in its raw, roaring divinity, but stagnation. The slow death of meaning when survival becomes the only remaining virtue, and I was told, without pretense or reverence, that stories still mattered here, that belief required narrative to endure, and that my role was not to condemn this age, but to contextualize it, to give its suffering a shape that could be endured without fracture. The irony struck me with almost comic cruelty, because I had once written hell so that mankind could understand sin, and now I was being asked to help mankind endure hell by understanding itself. And as the psycher's minds brushed against mine, I felt a flood of half-formed thoughts, prayers, regrets, and hopes ripple through me, the collective psychic residue of a species balanced perpetually on extinction's edge. And I realized that the warp did not only reflect humanity's worst impulses, but its unanswered questions, its unspoken grief, its longing for justification in a universe that offered none. I saw visions then not imposed but invited, countless lives flickering into and out of existence, soldiers, charging knowing they would die, nameless mothers, sending children to factories, with the same resignation their ancestors once sent them to war, priests preaching faith while privately wrestling with doubt. And I understood that what sustained this Imperium was not cruelty alone, but the human capacity to normalize horror in order to function. Within it, a survival mechanism elevated to state doctrine. Yet even as I absorbed this, I felt the warp stirring more violently, reacting to the consolidation of despair into something dangerously coherent, because despair given structure becomes devotion, and devotion feeds gods. And in that feedback loop I glimpsed the approaching catastrophe that none here dared name, a future where the Imperium's emotional output would no longer sustain chaos as fragmented entities, but as something unified, a singular god of despair and endurance born not of excess or rage, but of resignation itself. And the thought chilled me, because it suggested that even resistance to chaos, when stripped of hope, could become its greatest offering. I tried to voice this warning, to articulate the danger of a faith built entirely on survival, but language failed me, collapsing under the weight of scale and inevitability. And I realized then that the Imperium did not need prophets, it needed anesthetics, narratives that dulled the pain enough to keep the machine running. And that was what they truly wanted from Minar truth. But translation, the Emperor's presence brushed my consciousness again, faint but unmistakable. And for the first time I sensed something like regret radiating from that immense, fractured will. Not regret for tyranny or war, but for a dream that had required such compromises to remain alive that it no longer resembled itself. And in that moment of unbearable intimacy, I understood that the Emperor did not need my words to justify him, but to remind humanity that this nightmare had once been a choice, not a destiny. As I withdrew from the chamber, my thoughts heavy and disordered, I encountered a group of pilgrims kneeling in a transit hall, their journey spanning decades, their bodies aged and failing, yet their faces lit with a fragile, almost defiant hope. And one of them looked up at me and asked, simply, whether the Emperor still suffered for them. and I hesitated, because to answer honestly was to burden them with knowledge they could not afford, and to lie was to participate fully in the machinery of this hell. And in that hesitation, I recognized my final damnation, because hell is not only a place of torment, but a place where every answer wounds someone. I told them yes, that he endured still, and their relief was immediate and profound. And as they bowed their heads in gratitude, I felt the warp ripple faintly, not in triumph but in anticipation, and I realized that even comfort, when rationed carefully, could become fuel. Alone again, I reflected on the path that had led me here from a man who once believed that mapping evil could limit it, to a participant in a civilization that required evil to survive, and I finally understood that this age had no need of poets, only archivists of pain, witnesses who could bear the weight of contradiction without collapsing into rebellion or apathy, and that perhaps this was my final circle, not of ice or fire, but of endurance, where the punishment was not suffering, but comprehension. As the galaxy burned and endured beyond the walls of my contemplation, I accepted with a quiet, exhausted clarity that hell had not conquered humanity by force, but by necessity, and that in the far future, damnation was no longer imposed by devils or gods, but chosen again and again by ordinary people who believed, with tragic sincerity, that there was no other way.